Now, as the chair of the grand finals of the third YTN Hubs Youth English Debating Championship, I declare we begin the debate. Now, before starting the debate, I'd like to congratulate the two teams for making it to the grand finals. Well done. Before I announce the motion of the round, I'd like to introduce the judges who will make the final decision for this round. Now, let me first start with Ah-young Kim, who is the chief adjudicator of the championship. Nam-chul Kim, deputy chief adjudicator for our tournament. And Woo-gyum, one of the judges. And Han Ji-yoon. And we have Son Ji-yoon. And Pamela from Hofs. Dean from Hofs as well. Kang Seok-jun. And Bae Min-gyu. So we have great 9 judges for this round. Now I'll announce the motion for this round. It is, this House believes that national security should not be accepted as an excuse for damaging the environment. Now, before starting the debate, I'd like to remind the debaters, please speak to the microphone whenever you speak, okay? So please don't turn your mic away from your mouth. You should speak to the mic, okay? So that's right. So even when you make POIs, please don't forget to use the mics. Now then, I'll start by calling upon the first speaker of the proposition to start the debate.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and fellow debaters. As tired as we are, let's enjoy the last tournament of today's debate, and let's proceed to the actual debate. So under the motion of this House believes that national security should not be accepted as an excuse for damaging the environment, the proposition takes the side of not letting those nations slipping away from one's responsibilities and taking a stance to provide further slipping away of their responsibilities. So before moving on, let us define some key terms that will be used in today's debate. The side proposition defined the term national security as protection of nations' economy and politics, and the environment as natural surroundings that include the ocean, mountains, forests, and natural resources, and damaging as harming, polluting, or exploiting other nations' properties, and as excuse for getting away with one's responsibilities. So without further ado, let us get on direct to the policy that side proposition takes a stance in today's debate. Side proposition, the government is going to, for developed nations, the side government is going to take a stance which makes them compensate by purifying themselves of the pollutants that they created. And the pollutants that still remain in our globe as the responsibility of a rightful citizen of the global community. We say that environment is no light issue, and nor should the responsibility of purifying it should be bared upon one or few nations. We believe that many countries as possible, as the member of the whole community, should be encouraging and acting, be included in our policy to reduce the environmental pollution and secure healthier earth. And for the developing nations, which are currently lacking infrastructure and economic basis, we are going to make the responsibility remain as debts. So we're going to create a new separate organization that will be working as a watchdog. So whether the countries are actually doing the policies that we have implemented, and whether the countries are keeping the promise that in the name of debt. So let me clarify this point. So by saying the debt, we're giving the developing nations the chance to develop, but then we're also giving them responsibility in the further future that by promising that they will help in solving those issues. So ladies and gentlemen, that proposition is all for the respect of the developing nations, because they have to develop, and for the responsibility, the rightful duty for developed nations as a member of the global community. Under our definition to the countries that damage the environment for the country's own benefit, our policy asks for them to take the responsibility. So the focus of today's debate from side proposition would be on the term excuse, because under our definition, they are getting away with one's responsibilities. Let us move on to the third substantive point, which is first, the responsibility, the rightful duty, and second, the effectiveness. The later one, which is the last, our substantive point, will be elaborated by our wonderful Deputy Prime Minister. So the first argument about how the nations have the responsibility to actually solve the problem. As I told you in my opening of the speech, environment is no issue that should be neglected, or nor is it a light issue. It shouldn't be for one or few nations' obligation to solve it, because one, it is a very huge issue and it takes a lot of time and money to solve it, and two, many countries are actually engaged in those problems. That's why many international contracts have been previously taken to promote environmental protection to the countries around the world. But then the examples like Kyoto Protocol have failed. So that proposition is taking a policy that will be effectively measuring the solution to the pollution. The developed nations and developing nations, whether it was for their own benefit or for a crucial and necessary development, have caused the pollution to the earth. And the earth, which is polluted, is giving many people the harms that they cannot bear. So instead of making one or few nations that are developed to bear the responsibility, we say that, well, at least by promising in the further future, developing nations and developed nations should bear the responsibility. And second, about the effectiveness of this policy, we analyze this into two measures, which is how it's actually going to prevent the further pollution, and second, how it's an actual solution. So first, about the preventative measure that this policy will be taking. If countries are given the responsibility, and such responsibility, then there will be, before moving on, let us examine the current status quo, which is without any regulation. So if this motion, in the status quo, which there are no regulations taking place, if this motion is implemented by our government, then we say that countries each hold a responsibility, and wait on, sir. And they will reduce the unnecessary pollution first.
Ma'am, does the responsibility to conserve our environment still continue even in the imminent dangers of war?
Yes, sir, because whether the cause is war or the name is a further development of their infrastructure, we say that the fact that the pollution is created cannot be denied. And we say that the fact of the matter is that pollution is still being continued. So we say that under our definition of national security, which is protection of one nation's economy and politics, we say that if under the name, whichever name they have, if it's followed our definition and it follows our policy, we say that our policy should be implemented. Having that being said clear, let us proceed. So if we implement this policy, we had said that the nations will be reducing the unnecessary pollutants first. While for the necessary and crucial benefits that's very important to their nation's economy, they can bear the cost because they have already stable economic status in their country. They can bear the cost of pollutants if it's necessary. But then, in the country's perspective, if they have unnecessary pollutants they will be creating them to make money, then we say the countries have no other reason but to follow our policy and eradicate those unnecessary pollutants. So what have I told you today, ladies and gentlemen? I've told you why it is justifiable that our policy should be implemented. I have addressed the need and responsibility of the countries as a member of global citizens, and the effectiveness which will be after the implementation of our policy. So if you agree with our motion that every single country, including the developed nations and developing nations, have the responsibility of solving the world's important issue, then you side with side proposition. Thank you very much.
I'll call upon the first speaker of the opposition to the podium.
May I begin? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and to all fellow debaters. Ladies and gentlemen, in our society, as we go throughout our lives, we make various choices, from minor to major, ladies and gentlemen. Our lives is not an overstatement to say that it's based on choices. However, what the government side is mistaking today is that this is not a matter of choice, ladies and gentlemen. We cannot make a choice between the environment and the national security, because environment cannot exist without the national security, ladies and gentlemen. Before going on any further, as the leader of opposition, I would like to rebut some of the points that have been given by the government side. The first point of rebuttal that I want to bring to the government side is, can the institution that the government side said in their policy, in their model, can this institution function properly even in times of imminent danger and national security? The answer is obviously no, ladies and gentlemen. We do not redefine national security. We characterize national security as, first of all, fundamental. Second of all, it is essential for our society's stability. And third of all, it brings progress. This is why national security is the most fundamental value that the government pursues. This is the basic social welfare that the government should provide to its people. And this is why national security comes in priority of environment. If there's a war going on in our Korea, ladies and gentlemen, these institutions probably cannot function because it is imminent in times of imminent in times of national security. Ladies and gentlemen, although many people do not actually know, there's even a line in the Constitution that says that private individuals are obliged to give up their private cars, to the military if danger of national security is imminent. Just like that, national security is prioritized in every means. So conserving the environment of their point does not stand. And second of all, what I also want to talk about is the responsibility that they mentioned. Also, I would like to pose a question. If in times of national security, and if our national security is in danger, do we still have the responsibility to conserve the environment? The answer, again, as I've just mentioned, is no, ladies and gentlemen. Now, without any further ado, I would like to mention the two substantive that the opposition side have found in this debate, and my deputy leader of opposition, Dong-won Kim, will again illustrate another substantive of our opposition side. My first substantive, ladies and gentlemen, is what are the harms if national security is allowed? We have two levels of analysis for this. My first level of analysis, ladies and gentlemen, is of the individual level. Why individual level will be harmed if national security is invaded or threatened? First of all, obviously, is casualties, ladies and gentlemen. If national security, if a government, if a regime cannot protect their national security, war is going to occur, and many people, many innocent individuals and civilians are going to suffer due to it. Also, second of all, is about private property. If an imminent danger on national security occurs and a war occurs, ladies and gentlemen, as I've just mentioned, as national security is fundamental for the stability of security, an entire society cannot function properly as it is supposed to do in daily life. That's why these people have to flee their homes and give up their private property in the danger, in the risk that their private property will probably be bombed or destroyed when they get back home, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we believe that national security is important at individual level. My second level of analysis is the society level of how there are economic harms to the environment. There are economic harms to the society. I've mentioned in the start of my speech, why national security is important for progress. Without national security, ladies and gentlemen, environment cannot occur and progress cannot occur in our society. That's why we need to protect national security and society level, because not only for economic benefits, it is of progress to the society. My second and last analysis on this point is about the legitimacy of the government. Ladies and gentlemen, what is the role and the fundamental purpose of our government? Our government is here to protect social welfare to the people. And we pointed to the Maslow's hierarchy needs of how all individuals have a hierarchy of needs that they want in their individual lives and in their social welfare. And first level, the bottom level, is social security, ladies and gentlemen. Without this, nothing can occur. And this is the fundamental role why the government should provide social security and social welfare to the citizens. If this cannot occur, the government loses its legitimacy and the regime could be put into jeopardy. My second substantive, ladies and gentlemen, is what is the responsibility of the government? As I've just previously touched in my first substantive, ladies and gentlemen, a government role is to protect the people. It's as simple as that. A Korean government role is to protect the Korean citizens from any imminent danger from national or international level, ladies and gentlemen. If we are invaded by another country, it is the Korean government's duty to provide protection to its people and to provide at least the least bit of security amount to the government. However, what happens if environmental issues are put in more imminent and prioritized before these national security, ladies and gentlemen? The government loses its role, loses its legitimization to save its people, ladies and gentlemen. It's as simple as that. National security and environment is not an issue that can be related or can be weighed upon. It is a matter that is eminently different. I've overly emphasized that, and that's why the opposition side believes that the environment should be less prioritized than national security. Ladies and gentlemen, in my second substantive, I've already talked about the role of the government. The role of the government, as I've just mentioned, is to provide protection to its people and provide national security, in a moment, ma'am, and provide welfare to its people. However, if environment is put into prioritize, a government certainly cannot function its basic role. Yes, ma'am.
That is exactly the reason why we're implementing this policy, because the government wants to save their people and make the water, ocean, mountain, and earth available to their citizens. We have to protect the environment first in order to make their citizens live.
So what's your point, ma'am?
So I don't see why you're continuously saying that your values are important because your values is based on saving people, because side opposition is also concerned with saving people's lives.
As I've just mentioned, in our status quo, in our situation, it is not about environment, saving people, national security. Before environment can be expressed in order to save people, national security comes first. There is a difference of prioritization between national security and the environment, and that's why the environment cannot exist without national security. Ladies and gentlemen, as the leader of opposition, I have done mainly two things. I rebutted to the points given by the government side, and I've given you two substances why the opposition side believes that the government side policy does not fail, and we have expressed our approach at the same time. We have expressed our approach that the environment cannot exist without national security. Today's debate is mostly about saving people. The government side is refusing to see the long-term effects, the long-term consequences of their approach. They're only willing to see the short-term consequences because there's not a war that is currently going on in Korea. We beg you to oppose. Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to call upon the second speaker of the proposition to the podium.
Can I begin? There is a confusion in today's debate, ladies and gentlemen, because the side propositions and side oppositions focus on the motion was different. So, as a Deputy Prime Minister, I think my first job is to clarify what our interpretation of the motion was. The motion was that this House believes that national security should not be accepted as an excuse for damaging the environment. So what we are focusing on, ladies and gentlemen, is the word excuse. Because excuse means to not bear the responsibility of themselves. And we don't want those responsibilities to be not bared just because for the sake of the national security. So what we are talking about, ladies and gentlemen, is that the government here is pursuing both values. We are not prioritizing anything. We are not prioritizing national security over environment, nor we are prioritizing environment over national security. What we are having problem here is that people, for the sake of national security, contaminate the environment and do nothing about it. They do nothing about to compensate the damages that they have been. So in the case of the North Korea throwing missiles into Pacific rivers, after they throw missiles to Pacific rivers on the sake of national security, then they do nothing. They do nothing to purify. They do nothing to recover those damaged naturals to place in the safe place. They do nothing, ladies and gentlemen. And we, the government, say that this is the problem. So the main focus in today's debate is not whether prioritizing any values on, but whether the developed countries and developing countries should bear the responsibility to get those damages back and to recover those damages back once they did for the sake of the national security. Now that I clarified my stance and the interpretation of the motion by the side proposition, I'm going to review some of the ideas that was brought up by the Deputy Prime Minister, or Deputy Leader Opposition. The Prime Minister came up here and told you about the very clear two-step policy. Number one, developed nations would bear the responsibility to purify what is back to the normal place. So if they contaminated the nature for the sake of the national security, they have to compensate for it. And they should not be the excuse for contaminating the environment. And second, for the developing nations, we would actually make them the promise to keep their damages back into what the place was, into the normal place in terms of the environment after they actually improve in terms of national security. So even if the developing countries have very unstable national security, after they recover from that war, the situation that is side opposition portraying on, then the developing country would focus on actually participating in conservation of the environment. But the main reason why the side opposition was opposed to this policy was about the single institution. What they told you was the institution might not function normally once the war is going on. However, we have several responses to this. First of all, it is irrelevant to the motion because it is checking whether or not it keeps the promise. The only role, ladies and gentlemen, of the institution is the watchdog. Whether they keep the promise or not, whether they conserve the environment after they get back from the national security issue. So it is whether war is happening or not is unrelated to the role and action of the institution. And second of all, there is no relationship between why institution must be challenged because of the war. So the war is happening, but the people in the institution are not actually fighting, ladies and gentlemen. So there's no reason why those people in institution might be hampered just because of the war. So we see that there is no clear link. The war and the role of the institution has no clear link. So we challenge the Deputy Leader Opposition to come here and clear about that point. The first substantive argument was about the national security and the prioritization of national security. However, ladies and gentlemen, we again say that we are not prioritizing any values because we are saying that national security is important, but national security should not be excuse for damaging the environment because excuse means not bear the responsibility. The current situation is that people don't bear any responsibility for the environment just because environment is not theirs. Ladies and gentlemen, people damage the environment irrationally just because the environment is not theirs. However, if they want to keep the national security and the people get into their safe place, they also have to save the environment, because environment is that crucial to people's lives. They only talk about the national security, how national security proves people's lives to be secured. However, we say the environment also is the value that makes people secured, because people's lives are actually dependent on the environment. If the water is not clean, or if the air is not clean, then people will be damaged. And we don't see that it's government's role to actually prioritize single value over anything, which is both equally important. And second of all, substantive about the side opposition was the responsibility of the government. Before that, yes, sir.
Even in cases of self-defense, when a country needs to destroy forests for self-defense, do you believe that it's their role to seize that certain action for the sake of the environment?
Ladies and gentlemen, we are not saying that their action for the national security should be suddenly seized for the sake of the environment. We are saying that they can do the national security, and even if they have to harm the environment, they can do it. But they have to bear the burden, ladies and gentlemen. In order to secure the environment, in order to make the environment stable, they have to bear the environment eventually, ladies and gentlemen. However, the current situation is that countries are not bearing the burden and just contaminating the environment irrationally just because they want to secure their country. And we don't see that that should be happening in terms of government. Moving on to the second substantive point of opposition about the responsibility of the government. They say that they have to protect the citizens, and therefore national security should be prioritized over environment. However, again, we say that this is not the debate whether national security should be prioritized over the environment, because it is they both important values to be secured. So is it the government's role to actually prioritize one value and neglect the environment? And we say no to this question, because the government here is actually neglecting the danger of the contamination of the environment, and they want to do nothing to the countries who are actually damaging the environment for the sake of the national security. If they want to secure the national security, do something. Do something to cure the environment. Do something to not contaminate the environment for the future. That's the basic interpretation of the motion of the side proposition. Moving on to my third substantive, which is also related about the justification of today's interpretation of this proposition. We have to pursue two values at the same time as the government, which have to save the lives of the people. From the clean environment, people's lives are saved. And from the secured national security, people would also be saved. So what the government is talking about is that we have to pursue both values, ladies and gentlemen. And their side doesn't care about the environment. Their side has to prioritize national security so badly because people are at war. However, ladies and gentlemen, we say that war is not the every issue that happens every day, ladies and gentlemen. And the national security, the Act for National Security doesn't include only war, because national security, the Acts for National Security also incorporates and includes the case which they are throwing the missiles to the Pacific Ocean where no one owns, just for the sake of the national security, just to secure the nation. We cannot say that that should not be happening. This is not environment versus national security debate, because we are not focusing. What we are focusing now is a term, the excuse, not paying back the price and not bearing the responsibility. That's the thing that our side finds problematic. That's the thing that our side suggests that it is happening in the reality, because just for the sake of national security, they don't care about the environment, and the side government cannot see this happening. Ladies and gentlemen, whatever I told you today, we said the prioritization is not the main issue here, because in the current society, prioritization cannot be happening, because environment and national security is both important. However, what we are doing is that developing countries and both developed countries and developing countries have to bear the burden for the contamination of the environment. They cannot contaminate the environment irrationally just because for the sake of national security. Thank you.
I'll now call upon the second speaker of the opposition to the podium, please.
being the one and only high school student volunteer in Austral 2011 tab room, I found out that whenever I enter a wrong score next to the ballot, the chief adjudicator would give her scary looks or stab me in the arm. And what this experience taught me is that actions entail consequences. And this is what normally society, how this society functions. But what we try to prove on the side opposition is that there's certain exception within the status quo that we must recognize. And what are these principles? It's that when there's desperate action, and when these some kind of like harm is causing a direct existential threat within your existence, we believe that these kind of things should be tolerated. So this is what side opposition is trying to prove. We believe that direct threat to security of that nation should be taken into account, and this can, we are willing to sacrifice a certain bit of responsibility towards the environment. I'm going to look at 3 issues in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to make a relative calculus of national security and the environment. Secondly, I want to look at this question of should this responsibility be carried out? And thirdly, I want to look at this, move on to my positive material and prove to you why national security is directly related to the environment they want to preserve, and how their model is actually going to harm the environment within the status quo. So firstly, onto this issue of relative calculus. And Madam Speaker, we believe that this calculus should be really practical. Why? Because what side proposition has came up to the podium and told us was that environment is necessarily about things like protection of river or lakes and things. We never heard from side proposition why this is so important in the first place. We believe that, but on side opposition today, we have told you that national security is about the direct existence of that country. So we believe that this is the social fabric, like the economical, stability and the political stability and their existence is what holds this society together. So we believe that national security holds even more value than environment within our side of the house. But we have also told you that this is about the progress of society, which we have never heard any response to. So what side opposition is trying to prove here is that, first of all, harms to the national security is an imminent threat, whereas the harms to the environment is only a long-term threat that is even vague within the status quo.
Sir.
No, thank you. But secondly, what we believe from our side of the house is that these harms that we want to prove and we want to talk about on our side of the house is immense. It's incomparable to the kind of harms that they propose you about harming the trees or harming the lakes or harming the rivers sources. We don't believe that these kind of things are comparable in the first place, because our side of the harms proposed by our side of the house are so great. But then we heard from that side of the house, Madam Speaker, that saving environment is directly related to life. We have never seen any clear connection from that side of the house. Why environment is directly related to the life in the first place. We believe that they're not making a realistic calculation, because we don't believe that just because you're caring for the national security, you're just going to turn every single air within your nation into methane or something. So we don't believe that their side of the house's approach is realistic and practical from our side of the house. But secondly, to this issue of should this responsibility be carried out, the only thing that we heard from that side of the house was that this is going to cause a preventative mechanism within the status quo. We heard absolutely no analysis at all, Madam Speaker. We don't believe that how making these nations bear extreme responsibility is going to cause a preventative mechanism to other kind of pollutions. And we believe that, Madam Speaker, as we have told you that the actor that we're talking about are the states, we believe that these states are not really about the major ones who are polluting the environment in the first place. They're done by the corporations which don't bear the responsibility of caring for the national security in the first place. And then we heard from that side of the house that they have the economic resources to do so. We believe that that's absolutely not true. When we say that when national security is threatened to the degree, and their economy is threatened to the degree that it jeopardizes the security of the nation, we don't believe that they would have the enough means to actually care for the environment in the first place. I'm going to extend upon this idea in my substantive case as well. And then we have heard from that side of the house that they're even going to even in the situation of war, they're also going to like thrust their responsibility to the national governments. But, Madam Speaker, we believe that when people are dying, when the political stability of the nation is threatened, we don't believe that these nations should make a calculation that prioritizes the environment and says that they should carry out the absolute responsibility within the status quo. We think that's impractical and morally wrong as well. We have told you that the government has the responsibility. We told you that the government fundamentally has a responsibility to care for its citizens. We believe that's the major responsibility and the primary responsibility that the government has to carry out. We have also told you that it is related to the legitimacy of the government, which we believe is one of the major fabric that holds society together. We have heard absolutely no engagement from that side of the House whatsoever to this point. So we take this point as conceded as well. So moving on to my final and third substantive point about how national security is directly related to the environment they want to so much protect. We firstly want to say that government firstly needs to have a means to care for the environment in the first place. And then the definition that we heard from that side of the House was about the political stability and the economic stability. So we believe that in these kind of areas, there are some kind of supporting means that enables the government to actually carry out their responsibility about environment in the first place. Firstly, about the economy. We believe that when economy falters, when your national security is threatened, no thank you, and like your economic stability is falters, what we believe from our side of the House is that they don't have any economic means to actually care about the environment and like propose some environmental policies in the first place. And they wouldn't have the incentive to do so because they are so much put into a desperate situation like in these situations. But secondly, about the political stability. Madam Speaker, what we believe from our side of the House is that who enforces this policy is directly related to the government and the governmental institution that holds society together in the first place. Why, Madam Speaker? Because they are the only enforcing mechanisms that can they can implement the environmental policies that can actually make people abide by the environmental rules. And when these stability of these institutions are threatened, we don't believe that they would have the means to actually care for the environment as well. But onto my final level of analysis about how people's will is decreased and how this is going to further harm the environment, what we believe is that within the status quo, when they know that the government is willing to actually care about them the most, what we believe is that they are willing to care about the environment because they are the ones who come first. And environment, although it is important, it takes the second value within society. What their policy does is by prioritizing the environment and saying that, you should always care about it whatsoever, this sends a negative social message that environment is prioritized to these citizens. And what these people are then incentivized to do is that they are willing to claim their own rights first because the government is not the actor that is going to care about their rights in the first place. So, Madam Speaker, we believe that their policy doesn't really benefit the environment, but actually harms the environment. And we have told you about the responsibility of the government to care for its citizens as the first priority. For all of these reasons, we're very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Now I'll call upon the third speaker of the proposition to the podium.
Ladies and gentlemen, imminent problems should be solved, but at the same time, environmental problems also should be solved. Side opposition stands here today and tells us that we should solve imminent problems alone. But what side proposition sees today is the possibility that we can save both of the values under this motion. And having told you that, I would like to summarize today's debate under three clashes. First of all, the national security versus environment, whether there are two different dichotomies. Second of all, the responsibility that every individual or every country should take. And finally, the practicality of today's motion. And having explained to you that, let me move on very directly to our first clash. Is national security and environment, two different dichotomies? Well, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, the direct answer is no. They've talked about imminent national security problems, such as war, and the development necessary to follow that. However, ladies and gentlemen, we're not saying that we should not save our people from the war. We're saying that imminent problems, yes, should be solved first. They are allowed to prevent that war by developing. We're not stopping that, ladies and gentlemen. What we're trying to say is that after the war is over, after they are now capable enough to pay for their misdeed onto the environment, we're saying that they should pay for that then. Ladies and gentlemen, we have made it very clear in our policy that if one's not capable of paying for the environment, to compensate for the environment, they're allowed to have it as a debt and pay it when they can. And ladies and gentlemen, because we have told you that very clearly from our PM speaker, we're very proud to say that their imminent problem can actually be solved under this motion too. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, we want to talk about how environment protection is actually also a part of social security and national security, as our DPM has told you. Ladies and gentlemen, in political sense, environmental protection and taking our own responsibility can lead to a global image that our country can have a capability and can be trusted upon. This will lead to our economic benefit because better relationship means better trade agreements. Ladies and gentlemen, therefore, we see that the environmental protection actually leads to social security benefits. And having told you that, ladies and gentlemen, let me move on to explain to you why the environmental protection is a serious problem. Ladies and gentlemen, they have characterized to us today that environmental problem is not something tangible and we can't see it. But ladies and gentlemen, the fact of the matter is, it is an imminent problem. Sea level is rising every day and the global warming is in front of our eyes, ladies and gentlemen. Moreover, this is affecting the lives of the people, especially in the tropical areas already. And hence, we see a further development that is not regulated, that is not limited, will actually cause a humongous harm to the whole international community. And furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, the problem of environmental pollution is not only limited to a certain area, it spreads and therefore is an international problem, and furthermore can affect the future generation. And hence, because the responsibility is not in the hands of our future generation, but in the hands of ours, we say that has to be taken and not be excused just because there's an imminent problem. We say after solving that imminent problem, there has to be a compensation and no excuse. And moreover, ladies and gentlemen, finally, under this clash, I would like to talk about the progress they're talking about. This is a redundancy. However, I'd like to clarify. We're saying that if you want progress in your country, go for it, ladies and gentlemen. However, the problem is after the development, when they are capable of paying for their environmental harm, then pay for it. We'll not let them get away from their responsibility and victimize other international community and the future generation just for the sake of our own development and our food that's going to go into our mouths today. Ladies and gentlemen, we say, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, our motion is very practical because we're not limiting the development, or however, we're actually decreasing the unnecessary pollution made in the current status quo. Because, ladies and gentlemen, since the country is now aware that they have to take a responsibility no matter it's a national security issue, they will decrease for their best to the limitation the pollution that's going to be made through the development. Hence, ladies and gentlemen, we say this is a preventative measure for further and severe pollution, ladies and gentlemen. And having clarified for you how we can actually take both national security and environment issues together, I'd like to move on to my second clash about responsibility. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, imminent problems, we are taking responsibility for that. We're not saying the countries should neglect their own citizens, ladies and gentlemen. They should solve the problem. However, that does not mean they can be excused for the further payments of the misdeed they did. And moreover, I'd like to make an analogy compared to a single person for a better understanding of the side opposition. Ladies and gentlemen, just because a person was bankrupt does not mean that the person does not have a responsibility to pay to a bank for the previous debt they had earned on the bank, because the debt itself does not disappear. And therefore, However, according to side opposition, because they had a bankruptcy, because it was an imminent problem that can be an excuse even for the future payment, if these kind of people increase, we say there's going to be a further bigger problems because these people are not only affecting their own life, they're going to affect the whole national economy, they're going to affect the whole multinational companies, ladies and gentlemen. And we say this is what happened actually in reality, the subprime mortgage problem. And hence, because we see that these kind of logic can actually be applied onto a bigger scale and cause international problem, we say the responsibility cannot be neglected and the excuse cannot be made. The payment, no matter whether it's going to be in short term or long term, has to be paid one day. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, no sir. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, because as I have been explaining to you, this is not the problem of solely one country, but a problem that's going to go international, and even in future, we say every action entails not only consequences, but also responsibility. Now, having explained to you why the responsibility itself is a very important value, I'd like to move on to my final clash, the practicality. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason they have tackled on our practicality was because they have assumed that we're going to be relying on the corporations. Well, ladies and gentlemen, no matter what kind of ways a country takes, that's the sole reason we have a watchdog system who's going to look after and make sure a company pays for his debt or pays for the direct compensation, ladies and gentlemen, so that the misconduct cannot affect or victimize the ones who have not committed the crime. And therefore, now we have the force to make these people pay one day. We say the responsibility will not be excused in the names of the debt. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, because we have shown you how national security and environment are not two different dichotomies, and that responsibility itself is a very important value, and that our motion is practical, we are very proud to propose our motion today. Thank you very much.
Now I'll call upon the third speaker from the opposition to the podium.
Ladies and gentlemen, today the government side was very short-sighted. They seem so concerned about the environment that they're proposing to us a very impractical and very useless policy. Today, the opposition, however, clearly proved how an exception for saving environment can exist, and we proved how this exception can actually be a better choice in the end. Ladies and gentlemen, as the opposition whip, I would like to analyze the three clashes that I found in this debate today. The first clash has to do with the responsibility, the second clash has to do with national security, and the last clash has to do with the ramifications once the policy that the government side is proposing today is implemented in our international society. Now, moving straight on to the first clash about responsibility. Today, the opposition side came up with an argument, a very clever argument, about how any state has the responsibility to save its citizens. We showed you how the government needs to prioritize citizens over anything, and therefore should pursue plans to save the lives of these citizens. This is what the opposition was saying today, to save the lives of the citizens in the most direct way possible when national security is endangered and threatened. Since national security is directly linked with people's lives, we believe that this issue cannot be seen as trivial, even in circumstances when it jeopardizes the environment. However, ladies and gentlemen, the government responded by saying that they're trying to save lives by saving the environment. We have two things to say to this. First of all, according to the government's logic, then a state that has an enemy state lurking in its mountains should leave this evil inside these mountains. We believe that this is the exact problem. We believe that a state, once it is jeopardized by another state, once its national security has the potential of being destabilized, we believe that the government should take the initiative, even for the sake of environment in some circumstances, to save their citizens. And secondly, we showed you exactly how our policy, our stance would actually save more lives, would actually save the environment in the future, and thus save more lives in the future. We showed you directly the links between national security and environment, and we proved to you how national security, without national security, no state has any power, no state has any incentive to do anything that it wants to do. Therefore, we believe that national security, again, should be prioritized over environmental issues in imminent circumstances. However, the government side responded by saying that the governments around the world have the responsibility to save the environment, even for the sake of national security.
Sir.
The rationale was that environment is very important, and it's a very universal value, and that clean air and clean water is important. Yes, the opposition agrees to the fact that environmental issues are important in the status quo. But ladies and gentlemen, the opposition believes that there exists a rationale for countries and states taking the initiative to go into cases where national security is endangered, where national security has the potential of being destabilized for the sake of protecting its citizens. We believe that this fact cannot be an exception in the government's initiative, in its plans and its pursuits to protect its citizens. We think that without national security, there's no point of clean water, there's no point of clean air, there's no point of clean mountains. We believe that without national security, without the people living peacefully and with stability in our land, the governments, the states, cannot provide them with anything. Therefore, the first clash about responsibility has obviously been taken by the opposition side today. Now, moving on to the second clash about national security. Today, the opposition side cited several characteristics of national security where national security can be an exception in damaging the environment. We gave you 3 levels of analysis for the characteristics of national security. We showed you first how it's fundamental, how the very reason to protect national security lies in the stability of our people. And secondly, we showed you how it guarantees stability. National security directly guarantees the stability of states. No one can deny that. And thirdly, we showed you how without national security, there can't be any progress. This was very important in today's debate because, ladies and gentlemen, what the opposition side is saying today is that once national security is stabilized, the government could pursue plans that could actually develop technology that could save the environment in the future, thus actually preserving the government side value as well. To this, the government side responded by saying that national security cannot be an excuse because it destroys the value of the environment. And therefore, we should save lives through saving the environment. I have 2 things to say to this. First of all, they failed to prove how the process of saving lives is linked with saving the environment. They didn't link on how they're going to save people by saving the environment. This was very lacking. And secondly, they didn't rebut on the point that we brought up to you about how a state without national security cannot save the environment. As I mentioned to you before, there's no point of clean water, there's no point of a clean environment if we don't have a stable national security, because there will be no existence of the state in the first place without national security. Therefore, this second clash about national security has also been taken by the opposition side for all these reasons. Now I'd like to move on to the last clash about ramifications.
Sir.
The opposition came up to you and gave you an argument about the harms of setting national security aside for the sake of environmental issues. We gave you 2 levels of analysis. First, on the individual level, about how casualties occur, obviously, through our national security being harmed. And secondly, in the society level, we showed you how a state cannot function properly without having its national security stable. Therefore, we proved to you how national security directly relates to the environment, which the government side completely ignored in today's debate. Now, the only ramification about the policy that they're proposing today, the only ramification that they brought up is that this policy will work because, first of all, it will prevent further pollution, and second of all, it will encourage others to cooperate. Now, I have 2 rebuttals to say to this. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, as we proved to you throughout our speeches, net environmental development would decrease if we implement the policy that the government side is proposing today. What I mean by this is that, as I mentioned before, if a state doesn't have any stable national security, that state does not have the ability to pursue plans to develop the technology, the green technology that we need in the future, that we're lacking in the status quo, that would actually work to help the citizens, that would actually work to help the environment. And secondly, we believe that, as the government side conceded, the cooperation is very important in trying to solve environmental issues, as it's a universal problem. There are no boundaries with the environment. We're very aware of that. However, as we are all aware of, national security of one state, of a single state, could actually affect other states in the global community. Ladies and gentlemen, for example, when we see articles about China doing something, this directly affects the other countries that are allies with China, that are allies with China, that are enemies with China. Thus, one country's national security actually affects the other country's national security. So, ladies and gentlemen, if one state's national security is threatened, then this could actually threaten the national security of other countries. So, this would diminish the probability of cooperation taking place. So, how would we solve environmental problems if all the countries are concerned about national security in a certain state? Therefore, we believe that the whole positive benefits of their policy fails for this motion. Ladies and gentlemen, today the opposition actually promoted the values that the government and the opposition conceded today. Therefore, for all these reasons, we're very proud to oppose. Thank you.